We are talking the morning after the president gave his big and much anticipated speech on jobs. And we were talking 2 days before the 10th anniversary of September 11, 2001. And so we had these two agenda items, and I'm wondering how you reacted to the president's speech. And then after we kick that around for a bit, maybe we can come back and, talk about our remembrances of 9/11 and our thoughts based on the 10-year anniversary.
I thought the speech was an unexpected performance because it's clear that he's been listening to people who say that he's not angry enough and that he's not a fighter and that he's not fighting for, forget leftist, liberal causes. And he was certainly on fire. I worry a little bit that it was a performance rather than the way he really feels, but it's something that's been long overdue. I liked the almost bullying tactics that he used against the Republicans. I liked the...
which were they? I'm sorry?
Well, for example, I like the idea of his teasing Republicans who are against no taxes whatsoever. His language. And also the refrain of Democrats and Republicans that both supported policies like this. You should pass this bill, this preacherly refrain that he was using. I really enjoyed that he really did put fire into it. I just hope that he can continue this. He hinted at this barnstorming tour that he's going to take of the country to make his point. And this is one of those moments where he needs to pull a Woodrow Wilson League of Nations type of real effort to convince the United States that this is the right thing, to create a mood. He started last night, but I don't think any of this is going to go any further than anything else has unless he gets the country in a kind of mood that lights a fire under a lot of our more extremist Republicans.
Okay, so, now my American history is pretty shaky, but I somehow recall that Wilson was never able to convince the United States Congress to endorse his broad vision.
But it sure was a nice try. He had a wonderful speech. He was trying to do something which, if the cards had been aligned differently, could have worked, and Obama needs to certainly at least try this time, and he has better media than Woodrow Wilson had.
Okay, so very good. I think we share some, similarities in our reactions. I mean, I was struck by, first of all, just the quality of the speechifying. It was a stunningly effective performance, in my view. I mean, I just kept, as I was making my notes watching the speech, writing down things like forceful, effective. What an orator. This guy's going to be tough on the campaign trail. Now I'm reminded of where all that excitement came from in 2008 because he just, all of these stories that have been being published about his one-term presidency, about him being a failed leader, about him not grasping the mantle of leadership, not being up to the job, the incredible shrinking presidency, we're tired of hearing from the president, all this, some of it coming from friends, I mean, not only from the right, was forgotten in my mind last night as I was watching him give this speech because I said, this guy's not beaten. His tails are not between his legs. So call it the demeanor or the performance dimension, but that was one thing that really struck me. Another thing that struck me, we're not talking so much about the details of the proposed jobs program that the president has advanced. Maybe we can get around to that. There wasn't a whole lot that was stunningly new in it, and much of the particular proposals had been dribbled out by leaks prior to the speech itself, so I don't know that there were a lot of surprises there. We could parse that. But the other thing that I thought as I was watching the president speak was, finally he's engaged, maybe in that last third of the speech, when he was caricaturing the right-wing philosophy, you just think if you cut taxes and throw money at businesses, everything will be fine.
Never raise taxes again. Right.
And affirming the left-wing philosophy, which is there's a role for the state here. Remember the GI Bill, that actually did some good. Come on, we're going to pull here collectively together. We are a country of rugged individualists, but we're not only that. We're also a country of institutions, mutual aid, and all being in the thing together. And I thought he was, and the partisans on his side of the aisle will be, I think, cheered by this. I thought he was aggressive. I thought he was forceful, cogent in beginning to lay out that case, which I think is going to be the central theme of the 2012 presidential election.
Here's the question that I have about the speech. Call me, maybe the relatively informed layman on these issues. It seems to me that we can talk about tax policy. We can talk about long-term investments such as in education and
infrastructure.
In terms of infrastructure, that's what I want to get to, but in regulations, all that op-ed page stuff is good. But I think that to a layman, call it the informed layman, the question of the president creating jobs comes down to a 1930s analogy. What people wonder is why infrastructure can't be the main meal. Why can't we have shovel-ready jobs that people are put to work on around the country?
Right.
And, of course, that's not what's being proposed. And the way I heard it is that one of the main problems was that to the extent that that was part of the original stimulus bill, states took the money that was intended for that and just sat on it because they were worried about other kinds of commitments. Now, I want to ask you a question. It seems to me that we'd have to create a mood. When I say creating a mood, we'd have to create a mood in the country that would galvanize state and municipal governments to actually do something along the lines of the WPA instead of exercising that other choice. Why do you, as an economist, think that it's implausible in 2011 to put the common man and now woman to work in the way that they were back in the 1930s? Why is that off the table?
Let me try to see, and you just tell me if I get this right, reduce what you just said down to direct employment programs. Why not the government hiring people? That's what the WPA was.
For temporary jobs, right?
The government is an employer of last resort. Put them to work cleaning up parks, fixing up schools, whatever task there might be at hand that they could usefully do. And I think the answer is that the ideological landscape, the kind of political landscape that's out there, will no longer tolerate this kind of a role for government. I mean, I think a massive public employment program might not get a majority of Democratic votes. Certainly could not get out of the House of Representatives. I can't see any way that it could get by the 60-vote, overcome the filibuster barrier in the Senate. And so, it's just not in the cards. Moreover, politically, this is just me, I'm not an expert political analyst, but so it seems to me, the president wants not to play into this sort of stereotype of him being a big government socialist who thinks that it's the government that creates jobs and not private actors. I mean, the liberals have lost, again, in my humble opinion, that argument about the efficacy of state action. So that whereas transfer programs of the Social Security or providing health care services like Medicare and Medicaid or extending unemployment insurance to indigent families or fiddling around with the tax code to try to incentivize one thing or another, those things are all, still legitimate instruments of public action, even if a given proposal might be turned back. Large-scale public employment, which certainly would put money in the hands of people, and which might create, the fruit of that labor that would be long-lasting in terms of future infrastructure and, the sort of structural productivity of the economy. Just not in the cards politically. So that's my sense of it.
That argument, I highly suspect, has been lost because liberals somewhere along the line lost the ability to make their case from the ground up, because too often the sense is that the liberal view is the absolutely preternaturally correct view, and that therefore it only requires so much argument. Really, we have to defend ourselves against the conservatives and belittle them, rather than actually wiping the board clean and making a case. And Obama did a little bit of that in the speech last night in talking about how America is built on shared effort, that government's not always the answer, but that it can be, and often has been in the past. But it's interesting to me. I really do sense that there could be a kind of PR effort coordinated by the White House, again, creating a mood, explaining exactly why, in a few good bullet point arguments, the government can be the answer, that these government jobs, which would be intended as temporary, would serve as warding off a general malaise. Just giving people something to do is certainly something that a state might want to do. And then in the bargain, of course, also helping to repair the country, to prepare the economy to be better. Those are arguments that could be drilled into the country in the way that the value of better education and public service was by, for example, Kennedy, to mention something that's now a cliche. It's unclear to me why that can't happen now.
Well, John, I think there's a link between the linguistic topic that we just were starting off with, your new book and so forth. I remember you the last time we talked on Blogging Heads mentioning your colleague George Lakoff, who's become famous for talking about the power of words to frame political argument. I think there's a connection between the linguistics of it. I'm not sure I understand it, or if anyone really understands it, and the substantive politics of it. So the word stimulus, okay? That word, I don't believe, was in the speech at all last night. We could check, but it certainly wasn't anything that was talked about, and some commentators have remarked on how the word has disappeared from the White House's rhetoric. It's in bad odor, okay? The stimulus package failed. I heard the Secretary of Treasury arguing on public radio this morning that, the stimulus package... Pardon?
That it worked a little.
Yeah, well, it made things would have been much worse without it, was his case, and he was very adamant about it. But I think, it's a 60-40 thing out there if you polled it, that the stimulus package failed. Or this issue of the relationship between the problem of long-term financial imbalance. We've got unfunded, obligations or commitments through our social programs that are projected tax revenues are insufficient to cover. I'm talking about Medicare and Medicaid in particular. On the one hand, and the short-term, crisis of insufficient demand and joblessness, where, the sensible thing, and I think this is the sensible thing, would be to say, all right, those are two separate problems. The latter problem, the problem of joblessness, probably requires greater budget deficits than we would otherwise think prudent, because that would be stimulative. Okay, there's that bad word again. But the former problem requires us to commit ourselves to actions which are, of the austerity nature. We have to be more austere, more economical. We're going to have to say we're going to have to cut that over the longer run, but not in the short run. Being able to keep those arguments separate, framing those arguments in a way that you don't think the one is necessarily competing with the other, you've got an ability to hold them together, seems to me to at least be in part a linguistic phenomenon. And maybe the question I have for you, at least the comment I want to make is, it seems that the left consistently, this was Lakoff's point too, consistently loses these framing arguments. And I just wonder why that is. If it's something about the right-wing ideology resonating with some kind of subliminal or, subconscious orientations in the American character, and the left-wing argument cutting across some of those orientations in such a way that the right is consistently able to win out on that. But they are. And so now that, a guy can run for president on the Republican side saying he wants to make the government inconsequential, which in my mind, just objectively, is absurd in a world of, we've got climate problems, in a world of, we've got security problems, in a world of, we've got significant economic problems that are ultimately based on, productivity isn't rising. What about education? We do have to invest in research and development. The building of infrastructure is basically a collective, that is to say, government enterprise. So with an aging population of people who are going to be dependent upon government programs, which we're not going to repeal, it's almost certain that government is going to be more, not less, consequential in our lives, or at least it should be in a rightly ordered society. Why can't the Democrats make a cartoon out of that? What an absurdity! I'm going to make government inconsequential in your lives. It seems like that rhetoric wins out over the let's go build the Hoover Dam of the 21st century rhetoric every time, and I don't understand why.
You need slogans, and you have to not feel above the slogan. I think there's Morning in America. That was very good. I think that there's a tendency among liberals to think that that's the province of the dumb people. But really, unfortunately, to move people emotionally, sometimes you need to at least start with a slogan. And I think it's difficult for a lot of liberals to put themselves in other people's heads and see how attractive a slogan can be, to see how a word can get a bad odor and keep it, such as stimulus or government. The idea of people hating the notion of government and cheering when somebody says the government's name in vain. Nobody 50 years ago, even most Republicans, wouldn't have understood what the point of that was. That's a Republican victory. Liberals have to burrow themselves into the heads of people who are thinking this way and really make a case from the ground up. And instead, I think that there's a certain joy, and this is hard to peg on any one person, but the liberal establishment takes a certain joy in feeling superior to Republicans, to conservatives, shaking their head, making the occasional point against things they're saying, but not trying to make a brand new case in a brand new way. And in that sense, Lakoff, whether or not his specifics were on target, was absolutely right. I think people feel above it. They feel like it would be dumbing things down, but they don't realize that to make people understand things that are relatively complex, you have to start with the basics and then build. Republicans have actually been rather good at that.
So liberal elitism is the culprit, you allege?
Yeah, I think it really is. If you listen to, for example, Air America, which hasn't worked out very well. That was supposed to be the counter to this right-wing machine. They were much more, witty people, brilliant people, but they were more concerned with trashing the right than in charismatically making a bullet point kind of case for another way of looking at things, now that Reagan-esque way of looking at things has settled in so deeply. And Reagan was a pussycat compared to some of our new people, as we know. So it's a tough one.
I'm just going to say I find what you're saying now to be an interesting hypothesis, that the elitism that's kind of endemic to at least a part of the left. I don't know if you would say that about the working class union members who are voting Democratic in Philadelphia or Detroit or whatever, but broadly, the intellectual classes, the chattering classes, the journalistic, and whatever. That turns off a great bulk of the masses of the people, or it leads the rhetoric of the left to be more of a kind of preachy or talk down to or talk over the heads of or whatever. I find that pretty interesting. I mean, when I read Paul Krugman,
I was going to say he does the right thing.
Paul Krugman. I mean, he's a brilliant economist, as has been widely noted, Nobel Prize and all that. He's a very effective voice for the left of center view about a number of different, especially economic policy issues. Mm-hmm. But he does get preachy sometimes.
Krugman makes a mistake. It's his tone.
He said the following recently. He said, I know what the country should do, but it's not going to do it. Mm-hmm. They should want to do what I want to do, but it's not going to. Now, I understand it. I mean, he's saying as an economist, I think the right policy is X, but it's not politically popular. But as a sort of the art of persuasion and public rhetoric, telling people, look, you're an idiot, you ought to follow me, but you won't. It's not exactly the way to win the movement. I think the president, too, can be, on occasion, eat your peas, can be a little bit inclined toward that posture as well.
Yeah, Krugman's problem is that he does try to make a case. He makes that case twice a week in a very highly exposed position, but he's sneery. And he would say he's sneery because that's the way he feels and he's disgusted. I know many people of exactly his politics who feel that way and are most proud of their disgust. But the sad thing, and I learned this in my academic work and have tried to apply it, and I try to tell younger scholars this, but it's a difficult lesson to learn, which is that even with people who are inclined to agree with you, if you sneer all the time, it just becomes viscerally irritating, and it makes your argument less effective, and forget the other side. And so there's an extent to which, whether you like it or not, and who likes it? If you're a passionate person who's feeling pissed off about something, you're not going to like it. But you have to avoid that tone. That doesn't mean being Mary Sunshine. But on the other hand, that tone, Maureen Dowd's tone, is too jocular, too many jokes. It seems like she doesn't completely mean what she says, I think. But with Krugman, too mean. And so another aspect of the PR effort would be that there would have to be a smile put on it, with the occasional pot shot, of course. But mean doesn't work. One thing the conservatives do try to pull off, although there are plenty of cranky people among them, the general national picture is often one of trumpets and sunshine and positive and forward, and the other side would need that as well.
Now, one of the things that really kind of interests me about this is that I think similar arguments apply. We're talking about economic policy. Paul Krugman thinks he knows what's best for the country in other areas, like, for example, in the climate debate. Okay? Mm-hmm. Or even on the question of evolution and the biblical account of creation. Now, I know I'm treading on very difficult territory, and people are probably saying, what is this fool about to say now? But here's what I'm trying to say. He's going to give us a pro-Rick Perry interpretation of the climate. Here's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say some stuff is really, really complicated, mm-hmm. And expertise is extremely valuable, and it's rare. Okay, so there will be a kind of conversation that's bifurcated. There will be an expert conversation, and then there'll be like a popular conversation. And the questions I'm trying to raise fall in the area of examining the intersection between these two conversations. For example, how can an expert conversation, which is rarefied, restricted to a limited set of people who have the skills and the training to be able to participate in it, gain credibility so as to influence the popular conversation? Okay? So if the doctors tell us we've done clinical trials and this particular drug doesn't work, I mean, usually that goes down pretty well and people accept that you don't want to take that drug. On the other hand, if you threaten some of my basic, well, I give two examples. On the climate change debate, it matters hugely the relative importance of human activity's contribution to climate change as compared to other things for what we would want to do in the optimal response to the situation, how much cost we would want to impose on ourselves, how much economic hardship or limitations to growth we want to impose in response to the speculation about how human activity is influencing the climate. The question isn't whether or not human activity influences the climate at all. The question is the relative quantitative magnitude of that influence as compared to other things,
Sure.
and the extent to which what might have otherwise happened can be altered by us imposing significant cost in the present and next generation on ourselves by altering our behavior and our sort of basic structures. So why ought I not to be skeptical if I've got basically the left of center political establishment telling me that I shouldn't get this energy out of the ground, I shouldn't do these things that are going to create jobs in this or that particular industry because it's going to be dirty, I shouldn't rely on transportation systems such as exist right now, which are extremely convenient and seem to be what the people want. As Obama preached not long ago, I shouldn't want an SUV, I should want and so on, because why shouldn't a layperson who doesn't share the political orientation of the authoritative voice be skeptical about the claim? I mean, that doesn't prove stupidity. It just proves that they're not acknowledging the authority of a certain expert community because they're skeptical about their motives. Well, the question of evolution is, of course, very different, and I'm not talking about people's denial of the scientific, the fossil record, or the geological record, or whatever it might be, but I'm talking about an assault on my values. In other words, I believe that creation is the product of a loving God, or whatever it might be. This is something that holds my whole world together, against a bunch of people who have contempt for my values, but then think that I'm just supposed to believe whatever they say because they have PhDs behind their names.
Sure. Well,
something like that.
Well, this gets into a very complex question, which is that as you have a large, what we might call civilization, there are questions, there are ethical questions, there are technological issues that become so complex that there's a question as to how many people, and this is difficult to talk about too, how many human beings can you expect to engage the topics with enough concentration to fully understand? And I don't think that that's only a matter of the fact that the people who are telling you something different are ones who you process as politically against you. So, for example, evolution, that's a tough one, because on the one hand, certainly one might have a bias against a mechanism that, at least at best, sidelines God completely. But then to understand why evolution is true requires engaging with certain scientific facts, which to the typical person in themselves are going to seem rather uninteresting. And so most likely someone's not going to do it. What they'll retain is one demonstration one person made about something about whales or something like that, and that won't be enough. And so the question is how educated we expect a populace to be. The question, though, another question, though, is what happens when you have elected officials who are willfully ignorant. And so, for example, with Perry, to really say that the data is still not all in on climate change is a matter of his having had a poor education and or a populace that is not concerned with a leader being that uneducated. I'm not sure what can be done about the general populace. My expectations of most people's interest in engaging detail and arguments with a long arc is slight. That's just not what most human beings are like. But presumably we would think that our leaders would at least be able to make a stab at it. And that's a problem. That's a major problem that we have at this point. Philosopher King comes to mind. That is an ideal, of course, but with someone like Perry, or even frankly with George W. Bush, something has clearly gone quite wrong. Some of this is education. It's just education in general.
Yeah, I think there's another thing also, John, which is that I think the experts, so I'm still with my model where I have these two communities of conversation. I have a rarefied conversation amongst experts, the entry fee of which is you need to really know what you're talking about and something that's hard to know. And then I have a general conversation amongst more or less intelligent voting people who have to take action. And I believe that expert communities can be guilty of a certain kind of arrogance, in which they think that the questions that they have answers to, that their expertise permits them to answer with some precision, are the only questions, or are the most important questions, or that their ability to answer those questions entitles them to hold forth on other questions. So here's what I mean really very specifically. Now, the fossil record, the geological record, the scientific record, carbon dating, and all of that may provide a scientific basis that falsifies certain claims that are made in the sacred texts of this or that religious community. Mm-hmm. But the ability to parse evidence like that does not tell me about the meaning of life. Mm-hmm. You know, it doesn't answer the ultimate questions, which is what those religious texts ultimately are addressed to. Mm-hmm. Comforting people or equipping people for the contemplation or the, dealing with the ultimate questions of human existence. Neither does the scientific record on climate change tell us how to value the welfare of future generations relative to present generations, or tell us what our, quote, stewardship role is in terms of being custodians of, quote, the earth, close quote. Mm-hmm. Those are existential and transcendent questions to which science cannot begin to give an answer. And when the expert communities fail to respect the limits of their rarefied conversation, or to credit the merit of value commitments that people may bring, which they don't share, to that conversation, and instead try to trump people. I'm an expert, you're an idiot, get in line. Then I think they undermine credibility, and I also think they undermine democracy in some sense, because their expertise really is a privilege, a kind of thing that should be fenced in, that should be limited, that should be contingent, whatever. I don't know. Am I off base here, or what do you think?
Well, Glenn, it's interesting. No, I'm gonna be the mean one here.
All right.
I know what you mean, but my sense of things is not that most people are spending a great deal of time wondering about questions such as why we're here. That doesn't mean that the question has no meaning to them. It doesn't mean that it doesn't come up now and then. But I think that, for example, not wanting to believe in evolution is not because to let it go means that you don't have a sense of your place in the cosmos. To be perfectly honest, I think that feels right to us and to a lot of the people that write anti-creationist books, etc., because we tend to be rather overeducated and rather tortured, hyper-intellectual people. I think for most people it's simpler than that. They don't want to not believe in God because they've been given that belief in God and that basis for existence since the cradle, and they have a sense that to not believe in God would make them bad people. And then also, as far as evolution goes, you can't watch it happening. It seems highly implausible, and therefore, to the extent that you're going to engage with it at all, you're going to let it go because you've got other things on your mind. I hate to sound like I'm belittling the typical person. I'm not. If anything, I'm saying that people like you and me are very odd. And as far as climate change goes, I think that really it's not so much that the arguments, the fact of climate change isn't clear enough about how we should take stewardship of the earth. It's that the typical human being, including highly intelligent ones, is interested more in the present and maybe the near future, the recent past. But in terms of thinking about saving the planet for people 100 years from now, that simply has less meaning to a typical person than what's going on right here in the present, where one might be taking exquisite care of what's going on and have a deep interest in, for example, libertarian government policy or Republican government policy. So I don't know, it sounds to me like you think of the typical person, and this has nothing to do with intelligence, you think of the typical person as a more tortured, existentially inclined soul than I think the typical person is. Do I sound like I'm dismissing human?
No. But I don't require it that it be at the level of an individual who commits himself to one set of beliefs or another based upon their tortured existential contemplations of the meaning of life. What I mean is that the human condition leaves us tortured, contemplating the meaning of life, and institutions will arise amongst us in response to that condition to help us, live with the uncertainties and the vicissitudes and the mysteries.
People like to make sense of things, you mean?
To make sense of it and to give an account and to, give comfort and to calm our fears and, and our quest for meaning. And that those institutions are a product of this condition, and they are not, ought not to be made subordinate to a kind of, materialist objectivity, a scientific whatever. I mean, in other words, science is science, and the meaning of life is something else together, and science doesn't give an answer to the meaning of life. Or, in the climate change example, science doesn't tell us how to think about our relationship to the earth. Okay, I'm not saying that there's nothing in parsing the data about how the weather has changed, or, for that matter, the more recent kind of human activity argument that I saw reported in the Wall Street Journal last week, which was this experiment done at the CERN, the Nuclear Physics Research Center in Europe, where some people are trying to understand whether or not cosmic radiation plays a significant role in affecting cloud cover on Earth, and thereby in affecting climate change, and whether or not the relative magnitude of the role that cosmic radiation, over which no human action will have any influence, is greater or smaller than the magnitude of the influence, acknowledged influence of human activity in terms of burning hydrocarbons and contributing carbon to the atmosphere. So that's a conversation that's ongoing. That's a scientific conversation. Experiments, expertise can shed light on that, but it can't tell us what our role is as stewards of the planet. It can't tell us what, quote, the planet, close quote, how we're supposed to feel when we see that blue ball floating against a black background of empty space. Those are not scientific questions. So anyway, I guess I'm beating a dead horse here.
No, you're not. You're not beating a dead horse, because as far as I'm concerned, to the extent that school does not introduce people to the choices they might have to make in terms of where their ideology is going to go, introducing what seems to have been established as, has been established as basic fact. It seems to me that where would you expect people to get that kind of information on either climate change or evolution? And currently it seems that you have long books, and I think that humanity has never mostly liked long books as much as we thought. There was kind of an interregnum when that was the only way to get dense information. But you've got long books people are expected to read, and most people will not read those books.
Yeah.
Then wait a minute. And then when you have articles in, say, magazines that are about, for example, climate change, something Elizabeth Colbert might write, or evolution, any number of people might. Sean Carroll seems to be one of the people who does that a lot lately. Yeah. You've got long articles, but the articles already presume the truth of the general paradigm. I wonder if in an alternate universe vision of our society, there could be a way of giving people, the written equivalent of a podcast delivered online, explaining what these facts are, not just on isolated websites, but something more official and generally known. I'm not sure what that is today.
Yeah. You know what, John, I think we should give a little bit of time, here we are 2 days before the 10th anniversary of 9/11, to that subject, and I don't know I wasn't in New York City. Were you?
No, I was still living in California.
You were still out on the West Coast. So, what were you doing when you heard about the events of September 11, 2001? And what are your reflections, briefly? Sorry to sound such like a silly interviewer, but, your reflections on the events that have transpired since.
I had an email when I got up that morning, 3 hours behind the East Coast, saying you should turn on the TV.
Okay.
And it was not a flat screen; it was still a boxy TV. And I turned on the TV and saw the tower. I think it was the second tower starting to go down. And I think, like many people, thought of it as some sort of cartoon. I couldn't quite believe this was really happening. And I had two thoughts. One of them And it's interesting how this did not turn out to be true. I thought this was at the beginning of my career, such as it is, as a commentator on race, and I had only been doing that for about a year. And I thought, well, there that goes. I had always been wondering when people were going to stop listening to my opinion.
Did you? You really? You thought quite explicitly that once you understood the nature and the scope of the events that nobody was going to have time to talk about race anymore?
I really thought, I'm back to linguist. And I didn't mind. I actually thought that was an interesting year, but I don't know whether I'd want to do that forever. But no one's going to care about, slave reparations or anything after this. And I knew somebody else. I don't think he'd mind me saying it. Stanley Crouch thought that he called me and told me that he thought that black people would unite with the rest of the country with the idea that blacks after the bomb are going to give up the victim position and that we're all going to be Americans defending ourselves against this foe. That did not happen, but at the time I really thought no more of that. And then my second response was that the whole thing over the past 10 years has taught me about human sentiments of tribal affection and the good and the bad sides of that. I was gobsmacked by, I've written about this 2 or 3 times, by talking to 2 American Muslims. One of them was a black Muslim, one of them was not. She was wearing a veil, but these are native American English speakers. And talking to them about Osama bin Laden, I could glean that both of them thought that what bin Laden had done was horrible. But there was a part of them that had a certain cultural allegiance, a sense that as hideous as that event had been, it was high time for Muslims to strike back against Western aggression and dismissal. And I thought, wow.
You had friends or associates who had that view?
No, nobody who I knew
okay, but that was a view that was out there.
And, I thought they're normal. These were not zealots. Yeah. And this wasn't an overt feeling, but you could certainly feel it there. I thought culturally, they have a sense that the man who did this was a Muslim, like them, or religiously. And it plays a part in how they feel about these things. And today I watch things like Cornel West and Tavis Smiley angry at Barack Obama for not having a black agenda and pretending that what they really care about is poverty. And thinking again, wow, this cultural allegiance has such a strong hold on people that sometimes it can even take you to places that some might argue are somewhat illogical. And that is not the way I was thinking before 10 years ago today. And here we are.
Well, here we are. So I can't remember exactly where I was. I had been having breakfast with a friend on, it was a Tuesday morning, if I'm not mistaken, here in Boston, and came out to my car to drive to my office and heard the news reports of, a plane had crashed into the World Trade Tower. And then subsequently a second plane had crashed, and then, of course, I was following the events very closely as the news came in and the towers collapsed and the full scale and scope of the horror became evident, and then the Pentagon and the plane that goes down in Pennsylvania and so on. So that was that day 10 years ago. I don't know that I have anything special to say about it. I didn't have any immediate reactions of the sort that you were describing, except one. I used to be a contributing editor at the New Republic, and I resigned from my position, such as it was, which wasn't much of a position.
Around then, wasn't it?
Pardon?
It was kind of around then, wasn't it?
I resigned just after September 11, 2001, because of a piece that the owner and publisher of the magazine at that time, Martin Peretz, published in the magazine that said, "We're all Israelis now." And then he went on to make the point that if you take a bomb that goes off in a cafe and it kills 50 people in a country of 6 million, proportionally, that's not all that dissimilar from a plane that crashes and kills 2,500 people in a country of 300 million. And he went on to make various other connections about how this was a common enemy and event, blah, blah, blah. And I felt that abused his editorial privilege at the magazine, and I really thought it besmirched the integrity of the magazine. That's just my view. I say it publicly 10 years from now. I didn't make a big stink about it at the time, but I didn't know that I didn't want to be associated with an enterprise that was so explicitly partisan in that particular way. And he didn't make an argument for the position that he was advancing, and I don't think that that argument would stand critical examination. That is to say, Our position vis-a-vis the Muslim world and the Israeli position vis-a-vis the Muslim world are basically the same thing. Our enemies are their enemies attacking us for the same reasons, and we're all Israelis now. That was a position that I thought would have been difficult to argue for. Rather, he used an emotive and manipulation of a moment of crisis and tragedy in order to advance what I took to be a partisan and a particularistic argument.
Huh.
Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I want to make another comment. Yes, 9/11 occasioned the end of my relationship with the New Republic, but in an indirect way, and it's a long time ago, and no hard feelings. It also launched this decade that we have been at war, and it's been 7 years since 2000, 8 years now, almost more, 8 years since the spring of 2003, which is when the invasion of Iraq began. And I can still feel the intensity of my negative reaction to the country going down that path. I can still feel the heat. I mean, I wrote a piece in those years, or maybe a year after the invasion, called "How Many Iraqis Equals One Marine?" Which is a question that my then early adolescent son put to me when we were watching together a news report of a checkpoint, a vehicle full of innocent people, as it turned out, women and children, fired upon by soldiers who the protocol legitimated their fire because the people did not stop in response to a request to stop, and they might have been carrying a bomb that would have killed Americans. And so the question was, my son was asking, how much risk should a soldier take in that position? Because after all, he knows the possibility is that it could be dangerous to him, but he also knows the possibility is it might be an innocent person. And he's got the power of life and death. Anyway, I thought the campaign of 2004 that re-elected Bush and that delegitimated the war hero John Kerry was a demagogic horror. I can still remember the speech that Zell Miller, former Democratic governor and senator from Georgia, gave as a keynote to the Republican National Convention in 2004, in which he talked about the steel that he perceived in George Bush's spine and in not being able to entrust the safety of his grandchildren to John Kerry, and anybody who thought that our soldiers in Iraq were occupiers and not liberators was unfit to be the chief executive of the country. A kind of collective madness, it seemed to me then, and seems in retrospect to me now, seized us. And I began to worry that our reaction to these events, in terms of the construction of an internal security apparatus to protect us from terrorism, and in terms of a militaristic and belligerent response to these threats around the world, the mobilization on a global scale of our violent enterprise of extirpating these threats to our country, I thought that could do more damage to us than the actual destruction of those towers and the murder of those thousands. As horrible as that was, that our reaction to it could harm us even more.
Do you think it has?
And I still think that. No, I don't think it has yet. But I wonder if we are not in something that we're never going to get out of. I don't know how this drone attack against the guy in Yemen who put stuff up on the internet that incites people to kill us ends. I don't know where the tribal areas on the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan. I don't know where they get pacified. I don't know where this rendition of people on any city street anywhere on the globe, whom our intelligence tells us may be dangerous to us. I don't know where that ends. Assassination of leaders, I don't know how far that goes, or whether or not that doesn't somehow corrupt the American character in some fundamental way. Taking out, I mean, here we have now the commonplace conversation on a news program or a discussion show in America is about the country taking out this. Here we have Obama killed Osama bin Laden. No brief here for bin Laden. But celebrating that Obama killed, urging him to stick his chest out, shouldn't he get credit for killing? This seems to me to be corrupting in the extreme. And the idea that they hate our values, we're pristine and pure, nothing that we're doing. No particular actions that we're associated with, no particular interests that we're furthering that may actually be putting a boot on the necks of people. Rather, we're just innocent victims, the narcissism of the whole thing. We're just sitting here sitting on a hill, and then these barbarians come trying to pull us down. Let's go find them and take them out. Yeah, I think that does damage to the American character of a long-term nature.
So, of course, it just comes down to a thought experiment. I agree with most of what you're saying. And I don't think you think that we should have done nothing. I think that probably you're of the group who feel that we should have routed the Taliban out of Afghanistan.
Right.
But then we would have let it go there. And it's interesting to think of where we would be if that's really just where it stopped, especially if we assume that the Afghanistan effort came largely to naught, as it appears to have outside of Kabul. And if we just let the Middle East as it was then go on the way it was, and so Saddam Hussein is still in Iraq.
But we don't know that. People are saying the Arab Spring happened because Bush took out Saddam. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if Saddam wouldn't have been taken out by the Arab Spring just as much as Mubarak and this guy in Tunisia were taken out by the Arab Spring.
So you don't think that there's an argument, and I'm not sure on this, but
I don't know enough about this to really have an opinion, so I should just shut up.
Killing leaders like al-Zarqawi, that again and again we see that these people who seemed so permanent to a Middle Eastern person 10 years ago are being eliminated, and that society continues, although not in a way that a lot of people would have preferred, that doesn't have something to do with people finally taking to the streets. I'm not sure there's been an argument that disproves that, and that certainly doesn't justify a lot of the ridiculous things that were done once we went to Iraq. To be honest, Glenn, I have always felt, and we should close it out now at this point, I have always felt, and I have been practically pushed out of one room in Europe for saying this, that physically almost, that Iraq could have gone better. I hate the way it went, but it seems to me that if we had actually gone in with enough troops and with enough of a game plan and with a completely solid plan to restore infrastructure immediately, there might have been a more constructive story. It didn't happen. But some people, you say that, and you are an imperialist and a right-winger. I don't think one is.
Well,
did you think that?
No, I think I agree with you. Again, in retrospect, looking back on with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that some things were like huge mistakes. And disbanding the Iraqi army was a huge mistake.
Exactly.
For example, and again, I'm not enough of an expert to try to parse security policy on the ground in Iraq, but yeah, things might have gone better, perhaps much better. And it certainly is true that, the hornet's nest was stirred. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about that. Gaddafi turned in his nuclear weapons. It's a good thing that he didn't have them, because he'd still be in power in Libya if he did, I imagine. Or turned in his program, not his weapons, but the program of weapons of mass destruction that Gaddafi was working on. They worked out a deal. I don't know what the example in Iraq might have, how it might have stimulated others. Again, I think it's a very hard problem to attribute causality. But again, I come back to this thing of what this has done to us. Are we going to be permanently at war? Mm-hmm. This kind of it's Orwellian to me. It really is. I heard John Brennan, who was the president's counterterrorism chief advisor, talking basically about, in a very persuasive way, really, about the need for continued vigilance, the fact that plots are constantly being hatched, that we're on top of or aware of a number of different centers of beehives of potentially terrorist activity that we have to monitor and we have to deal with. And I thought, my God, and when he'd be asked for more specifics, he would often say, well, it's classified. Well, these are things that we can't really talk about. And I thought, my God, this is tailor-made for this kind of perpetual conflict, perpetual alert, extraordinary government powers as a permanent way of life, looking the other way at various, sliding over lines and crossing of lines that we otherwise would have been attentive not to cross in terms of civil liberties and the power of the state. And I just thought, my God, I'm not at all sure that we're in a good place going forward. And even if all the terrorists in the world disappeared, their ghost would still haunt us, so anyway.
Sure. Now, this is, we need to do this in a future talk, because these are large issues. Whether we're always going to be at war is a good question, because I think that the answer ultimately, if you think of always as being for the next 50 years, is yes. And what exactly does that mean? And what does it mean to say Orwellian at this point? Is it necessarily do we perhaps need a little bit of Orwellianness sometimes under extraordinary conditions? I'm inclined to suppose yes, especially when we're also talking Orwell when we say that liberals need to form more effective slogans. The liberals need to be more manipulative in terms of affecting the populace. There's some Orwell for you. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a bad thing, but that's a large issue.
Okay. I take the point, and we ought to come back to this. I was just going to ask you if you took note of the president's reference in that speech to a person shouldn't have to go abroad and fight for his country and then come home and fight for a job. And then there was a specific policy proposal to aid veterans, tax credit for employers who employ anybody who spent 6 months or more in the theater of combat. And it got huge applause, bipartisan applause, in the House, the chamber last night.
Patriotism, right?
Pardon?
The kind of the patriotic jolt that people got from that.
Well, I thought when it happened, it twinged me a little bit. I'm not against veterans finding work. I said to my son, with whom I was watching the speech, though, that, it's not at all obvious that veterans should be given preference over other people for employment. That's something you might want to think about. It sounds good on a bumper sticker, but why shouldn't they pay less for a loaf of bread when they go to the store? They've already been compensated in terms of the various package of benefits that are associated with their enlistment in military service. It's a volunteer army, after all. They chose to serve. Now, I'm not saying don't honor them, but I'm saying preferring them in the job queue is not an obviously correct or morally defensible policy.
Of course, the argument would involve that they put their lives on the line, right?
I know what the argument is, and I'm making the counter argument. They knew that they were going to be possibly asked to put their lives on the line when they signed up for the thing in the first place, and the compensation package was meant to take into account the fact that they're serving the country in this way. Again, I want to honor their service. And I'm not against the policy.
Right.
The only point I'm making is I thought that's a little bit of just, more or less cheap rhetoric that the president is engaging in order to try to win the sympathies of the country, because it's like God bless America at the end of the speech. You got to say it because it's the right gesture, but nothing. God bless America.
More manipulation.
God bless America, John.
Yes, God bless America, Glenn. And I'm going to run play some piano. So let us continue this sooner rather than later.
It's always a great pleasure to talk to you. Take care of yourself.
You too, Glenn.
Bye.
Bye-bye.